We need to do that. And I need to edit a bunch of code. All right. So look at our base item. Start there. Clean this up. All right. So we have our U item. When you set this up for replication, you want to add some logging. Player underscore log category extern. Then I want to grab want it replicated using all right. We need to add this function. Use the U function macro, and we can add. This is going to become a structure. Keep our item with an ID. We'll probably save inside the structure the primary asset ID, which will think. And there's some things we know we need to do. So here, so we only need this to replicate on condition, and this one condition owner. Copy this. We're not going to replicate our set. And the last thing we want to do is a virtual is supported for. And I need to. These can be moved. All right. We are going to want to define an event. We're going to do one param. We'll do f item updated to u full item. Now, so in our replication function, we're actually just going to broadcast this event. We need to make so. This will be what the client listens to. And we'll say ourselves. All right. So then we want to make this blueprint assignable if we want. So we'll say u property blueprints assignable, so we can play around with it in blueprints. Okay. So the next thing I want to close that. We need our bag items. We have too many. Yeah. I think I'm going to go to our player 8. We haven't implemented yet. All right, so we're gonna redo the player image. Well, kind of. Let's open up player inventory.h. We'll open up our player inventory CPP file, and we'll set it up over here. We're gonna clear the whole thing out. Start new. Ooh. So much work gone down the drain. Okay. And then inside our player inventory component, we're going to delete all this. Pretty much. Okay. We don't need that. Again, we want to start new. Okay, so I do want to do this. We want to have player inventory log. We'll need to add that to our CPP file. Well, and we need to do virtual override begin play, and set this to false. Been working on this project for a few months. I'm working on the inventory system right now. Redoing the inventory system. I've done it a bunch of times, but initially I set this up to be single player, but now I wanted to try multiplayer and play around with replication. So now I'm working on that. Okay, so if I want to have a World of Warcraft like inventory system, we need to have a certain amount of bag slots. And in the World of Warcraft's case, you normally have 5 bag slots. So we're going to create I've already created a maximum bag slot. So we'll have 5. The first one being our backpack, which we'll define later. And before we go any further, let's go ahead and set up our replicated properties. So we'll come in here and we'll say virtual void get lifetime replicated props. This is required for replication. We want to say do rep lifetime, and we want to do rep lifetime condition. And we'll say u player inventory component, and what we want to replicate is going to be some bag slot or some bag items. So we'll have the maximum number of slots that we can have, but then we need to create a u property. This will be replicated using, we'll create a new function called on rep underscore bag slots. These will be all of our bag slots, empty or not. I'm going to make an instance so that I can see it more easily in the editor because we're using u objects. And we'll make it blueprint read only. We want most things to be read-only for blueprints because everything should be handled on the server. We'll set up a T-array of U bag items, which is a custom U object I created. These will be pointers, and we'll call these our bag slots. And I will throw this over here in our replication. And we'll say condition is owner only. Right, we only want to replicate to our owner. Now that we have this onRep function, we're going to create a protected section. We'll say U function, and we'll create this void onRep backslots. So every time this array changes, meaning every time U bag item goes from null pointer or to a valid pointer, or the array grows or shrinks, this replication function will be called. Okay. So we can Alt Enter, create the definition for that, and we can say every time we update our bag slots array, this will be called on the client. Okay, so we have our replication functions. And let's just do this to stay organized, because this is going to become pretty big with all of our inventory. We need a couple things to happen, and we'll set these up as private functions. And we'll say void initialize bag plot. And this will run only on the server. And what this will do is this will set up our bags to the size of our maximum bag slots. So what we can do is say bag slots dot init, and here we'll do everything to a null pointer. We're not going to give any bags to start, and we'll say max bag slots. So again, what this will do is it will initialize our bag slot array of bag items to all null pointers, and it will create 5 of them. The other thing that we want to do here is to make sure this is done on the server. So we're going to say get owner. So we're going to get the owner of this actor component, and then we'll say get owner, and we'll do has authority, and we'll wrap this call inside this has authority. We're going to do this because we're going to call this function inside our begin play. And begin play runs on both the client and the server, so we want to only have this run on the server. Okay, so now our bag slots will be created on the server. We want to go into our player state. And I want to remove our inventory component. The new one I had created. We're going to create one called player inventory. And we'll dump that variable. We are replicating in our player state. All right, so now that we've done that, we can look at doing I'm actually going to run the project, clean it up because we're going to have a bunch of errors with my old inventory system. And then what we need to look at though is cleaning up our bag item. So the bag item I created implements our base U item, which is a replicated object, which is good. That's what we want. We do have a maximum slot count, so every bag will have a certain number of slots. And initially I had set this up to be a fast array, where a fast serializer array, but it's causing so many problems with editing the individual items that are in this that I kind of went back to the drawing board. So what I'm actually going to do is a few things. We want to, from what I was working on prior, testing in the background, we're going to want a U property that is replicated, and it's visible anywhere, and the blueprint read only. This is going to be an int 32, and we'll call this one a bag slot index, and we'll set this to 0. So it's a -1 actually. Yeah, we're gonna have a bunch of issues. Shire game. In the game mode here, I was setting up my player inventory and giving the initial items. We can't really do that right now, so we'll have to come back to do this and fix this up. Fine. Expecting to have a bunch of issues. As I attempt to kind of refactor this replication. It was kind of broken the first go around. The replication is pretty tricky. All right, so now we want to have I'm going to change max slot count's fine. That's the number of slots that our bag has. So currently every bag is going to default to 1. We'll set it to default 6. That's what the World of Warcraft bags are like. Every index will be start at -1. We do -1, which is like index underscore none. And we can do that to show if it wasn't called properly or set properly during the initialization up here. And I'll set our category to bag. So the last thing that we want to have is an array. We already have one down here, but we're not going to use the fast array. So we're going to use a U property. We're going to say replicated using on rep underscore, and we're going to call this item inventory updated. We'll make it instanced so I can see it more easily in the editor. Visible anywhere, and again, blueprint read only. This is going to be a T array of U items pointer, and we'll just call this our item inventory. And now we'll need to create this replication function. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here and say void on rep item inventory updated. And alt enter to create our definition. We'll go back to our bag item. So now that we have that, we don't really need this one. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to move this one up to the top. And we will move our bag item CPP file to the right hand side, and we're going to have a bunch of things that are broken in here. And honestly, I'm probably just going to delete this and we'll rewrite it. Really needed. Going to be changing most of how I do this. We are going to continue to do that. Okay. So we have our bag item. We do want to replicate our index. And we want to replicate our max slot count, and we want to replicate our item inventory. But we only want to replicate it to the owner of this item. That's important. We'll do that. Delete this. All right. So now we have this void initialize bag, which is a function we definitely want to have. We'll keep it in the public. The only thing I want to change though is we want to pass in the bag slot index. So we'll say in bag slot index. It's gonna be the index that gets passed in from the inventory when we actually equipped our bag. And once we do that, then what we can do is say bag slot index is going to be equal to our in bag slot index. Computer froze for a second. All right, and then now that we've done that, that property will replicate to the client because we have it set up for replication. Just going to slowly propagate down. And then once we do that, we will say item inventory init. Again, we're going to do null pointer, and we'll do it for the max slot. So this will just create a whole bunch of empty slots for us, empty. And what we can do here is say UE log FMT. We'll do log item, log, and bag initialize. And we're using this custom log that we set up in our base item here so that we can keep track of it better in the future. And as the logs get crazier and crazier, we're going to need to keep track of them easily. So our bag item is set up. We do have this initialize item function that's part of our bag item. We're going to have to take a look at that one. But for now, I think we're okay. One thing I need to set up back in our player inventory is we want to, when we add an item, whether it be a bag or we add another type of item to a bag, we need to use what is called a replicated using registered sub-object list. Very long. But the idea is that with that replicated list, we can then replicate all the sub-objects that are inside our bag, including when we make changes to that U object. So we'll just set this to true. And what this will do is give us access to a function that's called add sub-object, replicated sub-object. So again, when we add an item to our inventory, which we'll get to in a little bit later, I can just say here, hey, replicate the item, add the item that I'm replicating to this list, and Unreal will automatically replicate that object down. And because we are creating an array of a fixed size of 5 in this case for our bag slots, and we've already set them as null pointers at the start, every time we add a bag or change a bag, we're not going to be changing the physical size of this array. So the array will not fully replicate. It will only replicate the changes, the differences. So that's important. All right, so let's press play and see what kind of errors we get. So we can go fix them all. Here we go. Easy fix. The reflection system needs to know what's in there. All right. I'm going to delete this inventory. So I have a bunch of inventory components in here because I've been experimenting and practicing replication, and I ended up building a whole new project just to do an inventory system in multiplayer, specifically to learn to make sure I knew kind of how things were working. Um, so a long journey. I need to clean everything up, as well as clean up the actual project when we open it up. Let's see. We're not looking for much. If the player inventory is attached, when we press play, we should see in our editor attached to one of our clients a bunch of backslots. So I know I'm gonna press play. I think we have a bunch of stuff broken. So we'll go ahead and fix this. You can just delete that for now. We will worry about this inventory later. Let's just go ahead. Okay. Container slot. These are all for my drag drop. So we have a whole bunch of item slots and drag and drop inventory, drag and drop spells, all that is set up. Was set up. Now we're gonna have a bunch of problems, but that's okay. This, this, so many. That off. Move item, that's gone. Okay. Play, we got a couple more to fix. Bag inventory slot. File, see where we failed. Server, use that. We'll need to add that function back as well. All of our items have on-use capability, so that we can add spells and things. So I have a Hearthstone that's implemented in the game to take the player back. To take the player back to a specified location. So all that did work. Now that we don't have an inventory, it's not working. But functionality works, and all that's done through the gameplay ability system. Oh, it's gonna be a lot of work to get all this back up. But it's good. I think. All right, here we go. So, look at my player state. We have a component called player inventory, and we see that we have initialized with 5 backpacks. So this first one's going to end up being our backpack, and then we'll have the rest of the items there. I have some targeting set up. I have abilities set up. I can target and have line of sight set up. We can launch spells, cancellation, auto attack is set up, some damage set up. Again, this is all with the gameplay ability system. Also have currency set up, so we have gold, silver, copper. That is already replicated. The gameplay ability system is pretty much replicated. We have custom abilities that I created. A bunch of things that are in there. All right, but for now, we know we have an inventory system that's working. I think I set this up as a client. I should see my player state. Go down here. We should see, again, it's still replicated. So that's good. And we can test some of that replication out. So let's go into C++. Inside our player inventory, we do have a onReplicate bag slots function. And so to get in a good habit, we could say _log fp, and we'll do a blog player inventory. And this is just a log item, and we'll say this did not load. And we'll say bag slots replicated. Just to give us an idea that saying, hey, all of our bag slots are replicated. You can see it there. So now that we have that, we want to initialize our inventory. And all my inventory is data driven through data assets. So I think what I want to do now. We need to be able to add an item to our inventory. And what we were doing prior, what I was doing prior was updating things inside my what I was doing before was updating items in my game mode. I was creating the items. So we actually really need a function in here that says like give starting items. I think this, I would set this to be protected just in case we override this at one point. We'll say void. We'll say give starting items. This is gonna need an array, a map of data assets and their quantity, so it knows how many of what to give. So what we can do, let's go ahead and implement this. And we'll come over here and we'll create a comment and say starting items. This will be a little bit different too on load. So once we load the player in, they've already created, this function should not run. But in this case, we could run it. And so we might have an intermediary function that says like load items on begin play that then checks to see if the player exists. If they're new, then they'll give starting. But either way, we want a T map. Let's make a U property. This does not need to replicate, and this is going to be edit defaults only. And we do not want this to be read in blueprints. We're going to make a T map of F primary data asset IDs, and then an int 32, which will be a quantity, and we'll say starting item asset quantity. So a couple things are going to happen. We're going to load all this asynchronously, and then we will, after we load it, then we'll actually, we'll have to create the items, and then we will populate them in the bag. So we're going to have a function down here. Going to be void. This is going to be deferred. Now we'll say loaded on starting items loaded. And think I might set this up later. We might do a little bit just to get the item replication set up actually. So instead of this, we're just going to say u item asset pointers. So this will actually be loaded on the server. We won't need to do the deferred loading. I'll just start loaded. That way we don't have to worry about that. We'll have to set up loading later for saving and loading. Now we'll leave it like this. Okay, so now in give starting items, what we need to do is loop through all of our map here. So we'll do a for each. We'll say starting item assets. And this is our asset ID quantity pair. So we'll say asset ID quantity pair. And for each one of these, we need to do some sort of function to create our items and then add them to our bag. But the very first thing we need to do is create our backpack, which our backpack is our 16 slot base item from you start with World of Warcraft. So this is create items. So think bread, water, hearthstone. So we need to create our backpack. So what I'm going to do here is grab this U property. We're going to say could do T object pointer. I think that's the proper way to do this now. Not consistent with it. Of a U item asset, and we'll say starting backpack. And then what we can do is this over here. Now we have the asset. Again, we need to call something to create an item. So we want to say U. This is gonna be a bag item. We'll say backpack is equal to. We'll say new object for now of our U bag item. This is going to create an item. We can check to see if backpack is valid. If it is, we can say backpack dot initialize bag. It's going to take a index, so we're going to give it 0 because it's going to be our backpack. And if you remember what that's going to do, it's going to come in. It's going to initialize our backpack. So set the slot index, and then go ahead and initialize our inventory, which in this case it's set to 6 by default. We're going to change this a little bit because max slot count is going to come from our data asset, but I need to rework our initialize item function. Okay, so we create an item, we initialize the bag. This is going to be started on the server. So we'll probably wrap this whole thing here, actually. Change it to do it like and I don't want this public. Okay, yeah, it's private. So what we'll do is up top here, we'll say if get owner dot has authority. If we have authority, we will initialize our bag slots, and then we will call give starting item. Again, we only want this to happen on the server, and we can do it on begin play. Okay, so we simplified this function a little bit, complicated our begin play a smidge, but not too big of a deal. All right, so now we have our initialized bag slots. So we're going to, again, create the 5 empty slots. We're going to give our starting items. We're going to create our initial backpack. We need to, if this is valid, again, set it to add it to our add replicated sub-objects, and we'll call our backpack. What I could do here, just to set up our backpack dot slots to be 16, doesn't really, we'll keep it. So now we're adjusting we need to add it to our inventory, which is our T array, and we want to add it to slot index 0. We can easily do that with a add function. And we will do that with a server call. So we're going to make our first server function, and because eventually we want this to be done, the client should be able to call our bag and say, hey, add an item to our bag. And really this is going to be equipping. So we want to equip something to an item slot. So what we can do is we're going to create a server function. So we'll come up to here, below here, and we'll write server and client functions. And we'll say view function is going to be a server function, should be reliable, and blueprint callable. And we want to say void server equip bag. And we'll take a u bag item pointer. I'll call this bag item, and then we will take it int32 bag slots index, and we'll set this to next. -1 meaning it's invalid. It's kind of pointless if I do this though. We'll just set it like this. So we're going to create a definition. Writer automatically adds the underscore implementation, which is exactly what we need for server functions. So that works out well. What I do like to do is, now that we have this server equip bag, we're going to have some private functions that are also going to be kind of like helper functions for us. So we'll come down here and we'll say helper functions. I think in practice, you want to keep the server functions light. So like what we want to do is create like server functions can't return booleans or integers or anything like that. So you create small helper functions that try to do different things for you. So we can say try equip bag in slot. I'm going to take the same u bag item pointer, and we'll say int32 bag slot. So these are going to get more complex as we go. But for now, this is what we'll do. So when our server equip items So when we call server equip items, what we really want to do is attempt to, if try equip bag slot, we'll say bag item and bag slot index. That's true. Equipped was successful, and we can inform the client. If it failed, then we know something went wrong, right? We can tell the person like it wasn't a valid index, something like that. So when we try to equip our back slot, we need to check a few things. We need to check to see if the item itself is valid. We need to check to see if the index that we're trying to add the item to is valid. And eventually we want to check to see if the bag is empty. So we can write those requirements here. Is it a valid index? A valid item, index, and is bag. All right, we don't want to be able to equip a full bag. You never have a full bag. We also want to make sure that the slot is empty. So the bag slot. So there's a few things we need to check. We don't have all that implemented, but we can do it now. So we're going to say if our bag slots is valid index, So if it's not a valid index, this is the bag slot index that we're passing in. Or, and what we should do is check to see if the bag item is not valid. If our bag item is not valid, if our index is not a valid index, or our bag slots at that index, bag slot index, does not equal. I want to do this. So we don't have swapping enabled yet. So this we're checking to see if the item is valid. We're going to check to see if the index that we're passing in is valid, and then we're going to check to make sure that the bag slot that we're trying to add the bag to is empty. So if any of these three things are invalid, they return false, then we know that we have an error. So we can say you log player inventory. This is going to be an error, and we can say player bag is not valid, or slot index is not valid, or bag slot is not. Pretty simple. We can make all these quick early returns, and we can be more verbose with the logging if we need to, but for now I think it's okay. Okay, so if all this is valid, then we want to equip bag to the slot. And what we do here is actually, instead of initializing the bag, instead of initializing our bag here, we actually want to do this only when we are equipping it. We don't need to replicate an empty array for no reason. So this is actually when we equip that. So the first things that we'll do is we're going to initialize our bag, and this is going to be of the bag slot index that we're passing into this function. Instead of a backpack, it's bag item. And we do want to then set our bag slot to the index of this bag item that we're passing in. We want to replicate this sub-object. So I'll call add replicated sub-object. And then we can create a log statement that says we return successfully, and then we can return true. So again, what we're doing here is we're passing in a bag item in a slot where we want to equip this bag. We're going to attempt to do it. We're going to first make sure that things are valid and things can actually work. Sometimes this is done in a validation function. And then once that's validated, we can initialize the bag that we passed in. And honestly, it's probably, yeah, we'll initialize the bag that we pass in. We will set our slot to the bag. We'll add it to the replication list, which will automatically start replicating this U object, and then we'll do a. So what I'd like to do is give starting items. I think we can just say server put bag, and we'll say backpack. Backpack and 0. So that's the index that we want to do it at. And we will need to do, say, to do add list, add starting items. Here. Okay. So in our server equip bag implementation, we want to say try equip bag slot, and we already did it. If this is successful, we can do a new UE log FMT. We'll say player inventory log bag was equipped. Now, there's one part of this that we haven't set up, which we're gonna test this out first. And we want to move this to like an item factory. I think I already have in here. We'll look at it in a second. Maybe I don't. We'll create it, just a place to actually make all the items that we need. So we can create a bag, create whatever, and we can make them static functions so that they can be called anywhere. So let's compile this. We added a bunch of code. Let's see if it works. We should be able to, on startup, on begin play, have a backpack item with 6 slots, I think is the default, inside our project. All right. Fix a few more bugs. Delete that. File. Easy enough. All right, so if nothing crashes, we should see in our player inventory. Okay, so we've created a bag slots array. We've created a bag item 1. And we can see here we have our bag, which is bag slot index in our account. This is the raw item, and this is actually what we're working on. So this hierarchy of items is what we need to clean up, but we do have our 1, 2, 3, our 6 slots of our item inventory inside our bag item. And this is because the way we've set up our categories. But working as intended so far. So this is good. And we should be set up as a, yep, play as a client. So we know it replicated fine. Perfect. Yeah, save selected. Yeah, so our bag item, that was because we had them set up in categories. We can do it this way. So now everything will be set up in a bag, and we can see the 3 things that we care about. All right. So now what we need to do though is actually create what I'm gonna like call an item factory for now, where we can generate all the items that we need from a data asset. Because right now we're creating an item, but we're not using the data asset. So actually, if I press play again, let's go back into Unreal. I'll show you the data assets that I have for all the items, and we'll make sure we have a bag item data asset that has the slots that we need. All right, in our content drawer, we have items, containers, and I have a backpack. So right now we see maximum slots is 16. It's common. It needs an item texture, which I think I have a bag. Can give it 1, and a whole bunch of information. So it's common. I think, yep. Non-consumable. Does not have a usability. A bunch of things in here. We could call this a backpack. Starting backpack. Cannot stack. Max stack size is 1. It has a weight of 0 and a value of 0. So here's our data asset for all of our items. And what I can do is inside our player state, which I believe we have Northshire player. In our state, we have a BP player state, an implementation of that. We should see our player inventory. And I can go over here to our start backpack asset and click our backpack item. Now we're going to start with a backpack. And then here's our map that we created where we can actually say we want to start with a hearthstone, we want one. We want to start with a simple bread and we'll give a stack of 5. And I think I have water canteen, and we'll start with 5. So once we set up that starting function, our backpack will have 3 items in it with quantity 5 and 5 and 1. And then the hearthstone's on usability. So we should be able to click that and actually move our player to where we want to go. All right, so now that we have that set up, let me just save all. And we'll jump back into the code and set up like an item factory, that's what I'm calling it. So what we want to do is inside our items folder, a bunch of things in here. Need to really clean this up, but we're going to create a new Unreal Engine class. It will just be a U object, and we're going to call this item factory. This is going to handle creating all of our items. So we'll call this a factory, and we'll click OK. So it's a common practice to have a area that handles the creation of all your items. So we're not having to manage that. As it gets more complex, you want it to manage how all that's done. So what we'll do is create a public function. U function. We can make this blueprint callable. I'm not sure we need to do that really, but we'll do it for now. The item factory. I'm not sure what's actually going to call this in blueprints, but we'll leave it just in case. So we'll say static. This would be a U bag item. And let me do static, do U bag item for declaration, a pointer, and we'll say create bag item. And there's a bunch of things it needs. Well, not really. It needs the outer, which is going to be like our get world, a world reference, and then it will need a U bag item, or U item. Should be a bag, a container. What do we call it? Container asset. Then we have bag item, container item asset. Calling these containers before, but honestly, it was so confusing. It was not helpful. All right, U container item. Pointer, bag item. We're going to change the name. Okay, so now that we have that, we can implement what this function is. So what it needs to do is create an item and then return it. Pretty simple. So let's pull that up and look at how we can do that. So the first thing we need to do is create a new bag item. So we'll say U bag item, new bag item, going to be equal to new U object of U bag item, and we're going to pass in the outer. If this new bag item is valid, let's check the pointer so we don't crash. If it's valid, then we can call the initialize item function. So we say new bag item dot initialize item function. It's then going to take in our bag item asset and a few other things. So if we look at our base item implementation, we look in the initialize item, it takes in an item ID, which we're not going to need anymore, and then a U base item asset, which we just passed in a quantity. So what we'll do in our item factory, we will actually do int quantity as well. We need to copy this, go back into our header file for our item factory. There we go. And we want to initialize it. We're going to initialize it with an ID of 0. Wait, we want to initialize it with an ID of -1. We don't really care about that. And then we'll pass in quantity. So this is set up. And now that we have that, we can return this item. So this one doesn't guarantee that the item is created, but it will. So it will either return a null pointer or it will return the bag item that we created. But now we have a static function that can actually create the item that we want, and we can pass in the information that we need. So inside our player inventory component, when we say create new backpack here, what we really want to do is say item factory : create bag item, and we're going to pass in the start bag asset as well as the number 1, which is the quantity. And we need to pass in get world. I think is what we want. View container assets. So let's go to bag item and we'll do so instead of u item asset, we want to say u container asset and be very explicit about the asset that we want. We'll say starting. That better. This. Okay, so we're creating a backpack item. It should get initialized the way we want. One thing that doesn't happen inside this bag item, I don't think. Oh no, it does. Okay, perfect. We get what we want, and we set their max slot count. So we actually should end up, I think, with 16 slots. Makes me think I want to set this to 1. So if we end up creating a weird bag, we don't want to just give the player tons of space. We only want to give them 1. So let's compile and save and see if we end up with a backpack that's in slot 0. Another thing that we want to check actually while we're doing this is when we would try to equip a bag, if the bag slot is equal to, if the index is equal to 0, we also don't want to do that, right? Because for bag slot index equals 0. And it's truly just like less than or equal to 0. If it's less than 0, we know it's not a valid slot. It's going to get caught there. If it's equal to 0, then we know that it's the base is our backpack, and that cannot be moved. So let's test it out. We'll press play, compile, rebuild a project, and we should have a replicated bag. Hopefully it has 16 slots if our initialization function is still working. And it should all be replicated with how we set up our U objects. All right. So here we have our client. We can check out our player state, player inventory. We have our bag slots, and we do not have an object. So let's go to our log and let's filter by player inventory and see if we can figure out what happened. What did we break? What did I miss? Bag is not valid or slot index is not valid. Ah, okay. Yeah. It's the point that I just added where it's not 0, but that doesn't make sense. So I realized my mistake here. So this will work. We need a different way to do it. We'll just make it non-draggable. So let's restart and we can test it. Super nice to have our custom logging so we don't have to fish through hundreds of other line items. All right, let's press play again. Hit our player state, and we'll go to our player. Okay, here we go. We see that we have our backpack, we have our bag, and we can see the bag slot index. Item ID is -1, which is what we set in the initialization function. In our factory. So if I go back to our factory just to make sure that that was working, you can see that we set it to -1. We set the quantity to 1, or what we're passing in this case. Should be 1. But we should see our item inventory. Okay, so what did not happen was the initialization function. So that's what we need to look at. So it set it to 1 back slot and never reset the value of the 6. Let's make sure our assets, our item asset is correct. It is set to 16 slots. And let me make sure that my player state is set with the correct bag item. I believe it is. No, it's not. So that's partially. So we'll give it backpack. File and save. Go to our player state, player inventory, our bag, our item. There we go. Okay. So we fully created a bag, our backpack with our initial 16 slots replicated to the client. Perfect. So now let's do our initial item that we can do in here. So what we want to do is do a U item. We'll call it new item, and we want to create them using our item factory that we just set up. So we'll go into here, and what I'll do is copy this function, and we'll say create item. And instead of U bag item, we'll turn a U item. And this would be an item asset. And here we'll do a very similar thing where we're going to say U item. A new item is going to be equal to a new object. We'll pass in U item and the outer. Here we'll say if the new item is valid, call a new item dot initialize item, and we will the item asset and quantity, and then we'll return new item. Basically what we did up here, this one's just more specific. You could call this to create an item for your bag, but we wanted to, I like having an explicit function for it. So back in our player inventory, we're going to say item factory, create item. We're going to pass in this. We are going to pass in our starting our asset quantity. What we need, the asset quantity pair. One thing that we do want to check is to check to see if our starting backpack asset is valid before we. What we'll do is if it's not valid, we'll do a return, and we'll throw an error. So again, just some logging to make sure that we have stuff properly. We'll say player inventory error starting backpack asset not valid. We're gonna do a similar thing in our loop. So we're gonna check to see if our asset quantity pair at our key. We'll continue. Starting asset not valid. Yeah, so we're going to attempt to create the items, but we want to check to make sure that the item that we're passing in is valid. If it's not, then we'll just break and do the next one. And this is just so that we don't end up with a bunch of crashes. So here we're going to create a new item. It's going to be with the asset key and then the value, which is the quantity. If this new item is valid, we then want to add it to our bag. In this case, we know that we're going to be adding it to our backpack. We will eventually want to create a function that adds it directly to our backpack, or like a server add item function. But we don't have that yet. So what we'll do is say back slots of 0. So we'll get our backpack and we're going to say item inventory, and we will do add. No, we need to add it to 0. We'll add the first item to the first one. So we'll set it equal to new item. So what's going to happen here, we're going to continuously override because we're adding it to 0, 1, and 2. What this means is, though, we need to create a function to add to bag and add item to available slot. Or some functions, but we can test this replication out. Now, what I like to do though is in here say log item new item starting item valid. And then we'll create some helper functions to build this output. Control to save. I think we're okay. Trying to think before we continue. We're not adding this to the replication list, so we'll need to do that as well. Add replicated subobject, new item. So as part of the adding an item to our inventory, that's what's going to happen. So let's compile and save, and we'll see how it's working. All right. Let's go to our player state. I think we should see water maybe in that slot if it works. So we created item 0, 1, and 2. Item 2 is in there, so that's working. All right, so now we need to add the helper functions to actually get this to work properly. And we want to do some of these things inside like our bag item itself. So when we get the bag here, we want to say add item, which we can create a function for. So if we go to here, say bool add item. And what we can do is say u item. And we first want to check to see if our item is null. If it's not valid, we can throw a warning out. Or an error. Oh, an error. Pretty bad if we're trying to do that. Then we want to get our first available slot. So we're going to do a const empty slot index. This is going to search our array and look for a empty slot. So we're looking for an item that's null. If it is null, it's going to return the index of that. Then we want to make sure that that index is valid. So we're going to check to see if it's index none, which index none equals -1. This will be if we have no slots in here, then we know that our bag is empty, which could be a good warning for us. And then last but not least, if all this is true, we'll set our item and we will return true. Now there's something that I have in here that we have not implemented yet, which we'll do at a later time. So instead of bag slots here, what we can do is call bag slots.add item, and we'll pass in the new item. We still need to call add replicated subobject because it's an object that the player inventory cares about, so it's important that we replicate it back to the client. But in this case, the way we set it up, we should be able to see the 3 items that we create: the hearthstone, the water, and the bread. Now, we could set it up so you could read it a little bit better, but I need to change the base item. So right now, you only see the item ID because it's replicated. The item asset is tagged as replicated, but you don't replicate data assets. So we need to convert that to a struct. All right, so compile. Let's press play. This is our one client that we do have. We'll go to our player state. We'll go to our player inventory. And you can see inside our bag, which is our backpack, has 16 slots. In the inventory, we have 3 different items. They're all going to have the same ID value, I believe. But we know that these are different items, which is perfect. So now that we've done that, maybe it is time to look at creating, going back to a structure. So instead of saving this, we want to, in the initialize function, what we do here, what we could do, real quick and dirty way, we'll do that. We really don't need this ID. Let's make this an ftext, and we'll say item name. We need to go to here, and we'll say item name. Be a quick way for us to replicate what we want. So we'll check if item in item assets is valid. If it is valid, we're going to say item name is equal to in item assets name. If it's not, generic item. Oh, what is it? Ftext. I'm not even sure what this is. In source string ftext. I forgot what this function is. We're not even gonna worry about it. It'll work. All right, let's compile this. We should see a whole bunch of names replicated versus that ID because we don't really care about that ID value anymore. I really should clean up this function. So what we need to do is in our base item asset, we have all these values. That I want to clean up. And we want to convert these to... We could store this all into one structure, which I think I had done before. So we have item details, yeah. This is probably what we'll end up doing. Is item details within our base item asset. So what I can do, because we don't want to replicate this item anymore. We're not going to be replicating the yeah. We're not going to be we can easily grab this thing, but we're not going to easily replicate. You don't replicate primary data asset. So let's check it out. All right. So we'll press play. We'll check to see if those items that we created. Remember, if we go to Northshire, we have our items. We have containers, drinks, food. We have all these items available. I'm assuming if I have simple bread, it's set up simple. It's called honey bread. If I go to our player state, we should see those names now, I believe. So yeah. I don't know if you can see this on the stream, but we have our backpack with our inventory, and you can see we have a Hearthstone, we have honey bread, and we have refreshing spring water. We know that our items actually are in the bag in the slots that we wanted as first available slots. We haven't implemented swapping or anything like that, but that will come. Okay, so if we've updated this item information asset inside our base item when we initialize our item, what that means is we probably want a replicated value. I'm gonna grab the item, we'll call it details, and we can say f item details and item details. And what we can do if this is replicated, which we'll set up over there, we'll set item in item asset item. We're going to keep the same name. So the one thing we need to do here is when we replicate, we want to replicate item details. Go. Only to the owner, and this is not going to change because it's basically static information. Okay. So if I press play again, we'll rebuild. We can adjust our item asset, and we actually should be able to see all the item information that we want being replicated back to the client once it's added to our inventory slot, which is inside our backpack. All right. So here we go, loading it up. We'll test this out with the Hearthstone. Oh, we have simple bread open. So now we see item details, which is the same information again, but we'll call it bread. We'll give it the icon of bread. We're gonna remove this other stuff here in a minute. Description, copy that, paste that in there. Quantity, that needs to go away. Value and item type, food. Value is 0.05. You can see it's not 1-for-1 yet, but we'll update that. These are all just different implementations of what I've been working on. So compile. Let's press play. if we go to our player state, that value should be replicated now. So if we go into it, we can see our item inventory. I think this was our bread. What's the item? Not public. Let me see what I did wrong here. Hmm. Da, 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 da. Here we go. We can't see anything because we don't have it visible. Well, we can see this replicates, but I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to replicate data assets. I think that seems a little wonky. Because it's loaded on the server. That might be something I should check. We'll try it out. If we do, I think we'll add it back. The item assets. I'm pretty sure on that one, but we can check it here. Let's see. Unreal Engine replicate data asset. How do I replicate data assets? You don't need to replicate data assets. They're a special class that has only one copy. Oh, I can do that. Ah, that's sweet. I didn't realize that. That makes my life a lot easier. Okay. Learn something new every day. All right, so we have our item details, our item. You can see our item asset. It has the pointer reference to it. Now we can't see the specific information about it, but that's okay. So if we go to simple bread, though, we can see our details. We have that information loaded, but we have the item and it's here. It's pointing to the same object, and we know it's loaded. So I think it's pointing to. We have the pointer. So this might be more efficient than passing. Kind of intrigued by that. Good news, data asset pointers can be passed around between server and client very efficiently, and they always point in the same. So in this case, your idea about using card definition, right? You can simply pass a data asset around as card definition pointer variable. Replicating data asset references as an active variable is, of course, also possible. To replicate any active variable, right? That will cause the data to copy from the server to the client. Be aware that on the client, the value will stay null until it's received data from the server. This can take a few frames. If you want to respond directly to the value becoming non-null on client, specify a function to call via replicated using. Right, okay. This is fine. So basically it won't be there immediately, but it will. Okay. So we don't need item detail. No. I should be able to delete this. Which, like, okay. We really don't need to do this because it's inside our item asset, but that's fine. Before we exit, let's make sure that we had our quantity, which we do, 5. And 5. Perfect. So we have our item name. Kind of just gives us a few things to look at. We should be able to pull the info. If we go to our player, I'm going to do something a little wrong. You can see I'm using some delays to like play around. Here I'm equipping an item asset. So we already have a delay built in, which is fine. But in reality, you don't really want to do that because we should do everything when it's replicated or on load. But in this case, we already have a 0.2-second delay, so we should be fine when I play around with my inventory. So I'm going to get the inventory. I should be able to say get bag slots. Yeah, so we say get bag slots. I can say get reference, so we'll get the first bag slot, which will be our backpack. I want to see if I can get some information. We'll move that over here. From this, we know we can get our get inventory items, and we'll say we'll get our first one. Lots of gets here. But this gives us our item, and I should be able to say get name. And we'll do another one, get item description. And we'll format our text. So we'll say item name and item description. That in, grab our text, connect those pins up. That. So we're gonna get the first item in our first bag, which is our backpack. And we'll go to our player inventory. Our Hearthstone here is what we're gonna see. Let's open up that one. Hearthstone, we just want to make sure we have information. So item details is going away. So we have Hearthstone, a magical stone that binds your soul to a specific location. All right, so if I press play, we should see 0.2 seconds later on our client's item Hearthstone. It was going away super fast. We'll change the color, make it red so see it, and we'll set the time to 10 seconds. So and we'll press play. Here we go. So on the client, item Hearthstone, item description. That proves to me that we're replicating that item as we wanted, which is good. Okay. Perfect. A little wonky way to check, but everything's kind of a little wonky right now anyway. All right, so the last thing I want to add today is when we add our item here, we want to do this inside a server function. So we're going to go back to our player inventory component, and we are going to create a function to add items. So here we have server functions in our public. I'm going to copy this one. And we will say void server add item. And we need to pass in the item that we want to add. So we'll say u item pointer, and we'll say item 2. And we'll just say item. And we're going to pass in there's a couple things we want. We just want to add an item. And then we also want to be able to add an item to a specific bag and slot. So add item to any bag or to any avail space. And then we're going to have another one eventually that's add item to a specific bag in a specific slot. But in this case, we'll just do this one. So when we add our item here, we actually want to move this code and put it in here. And instead of item, we'll call it there. And when we create a new item, we want to say server add item, and we're going to say new item. So what this is doing again, we are looping through all of the starting items in the map that we had set up, and we are making sure that the key is valid, so that the asset itself is valid. If it's valid, then we're going to create a new item with that asset, and we will check to see if that new item is valid. If that new item is valid, perfect. Then we will do server add item, which will then call this function up here. This function up here should first check to see, this is going to be moved into some helper functions as well, but first we're going to check to see if the item is not valid. If the item we're trying to add is not valid, we're just going to do an early return. And we'll do a UE log fmt player inventory. This would be an error, and we can say item it is not valid. And if that's not the case, then we can make sure we replicate the item, and then here we'll do bag slots, and we can create our very first helper function for adding an item. So we'll say bool add item, try add item, any slot. Yeah. Try add item slot, I guess. And we'll create the implementation for that. What we can do is we basically need to go through all of our bag slots. So, I've already written a lot of this. What we'll do, oh, that did not work. We're going to loop through all of our bag slots. We're going to get the bag. We're going to check to see if it exists. We're going to see if it has any available slots. And then we'll add the item. So some of this stuff does not exist, right? Because we haven't created all these helper functions. We do know that our bag item itself, or at least I thought it did. Base item. As an add item. So we need to add this to our function definition. There we go. Item. We'll add it here. This checks to see if it doesn't have any available slots. We actually do not have this, so we can come back to it. To do add. All right. So now that we have this try add slots, we're going to go back up to our server function, where we're going to say if try put bag slots new item. One thing that doesn't happen here is I don't replicate the item, and I wonder if I need to do that. Let's see. For some reason, I wasn't adding adding as a replicated sub object, so I'm a little concerned why I wasn't. So I'm checking. I was working on another project where server add new item and create the item we add. So it's just a 2. So the issue is when we add it here, when we try to add slot to empty slot, what we want to do, I think, is replicate when it's successful. So inside our if statement, if it's successful, we want to then replicate the item. And I don't know if I like doing that in the server function. We might do it somewhere else, but for now, we'll leave it here. And this just supports right now empty slots. It does not. So I have written support for swapping and stacking. But I don't think we'll implement that yet today. So we'll press play and we'll see what happens. I think we can clean some stuff up here. Like we can make this a constant value, or we can move it to the if statements. Check our output log. So we'll filter. This is what's so good about doing these custom filters. Is we can go to our player inventory and you can see successfully equipped bag in slot 0. Bag was equipped. Starting item was valid. Added to bag. Added bag 0. Bag slots. So we know stuff is happening properly. So if we go to our again to our player state, this is our client. This is client 0. We're running in a dedicated server format right now. So if I go down to our player inventory, we go to again our bag slots. We can see our bag has an item inventory. We also have all the item information for our backpack stored here under item. But you can see we still have our items working as intended. So this is perfect. Okay. All right, I think we'll leave that here for now. Or maybe we could clean some stuff up. Maybe that's what we'll do. We'll clean some code up so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. So that's multiplayer test. That's the one where I was testing what I wanted to work on. Maybe we go to our player inventory component and we can kind of clean some of the stuff. So like I can cut this and move it into the if statement to kind of simplify some of this up a bit. Same thing with our new item here. Paste it in there. I think we can make this constant. So we could say const. And we could theoretically call that the tuple that we need, but we know that our on slots are being replicated to our client. And some of the stuff we can add. So this one's interesting. We can work on our bag asset a little bit. So if we go to our bag item, we have this function has available slots. We want to check to see if our bag has any available slots. And this is a perfect implementation for helper function. So in our bag item, too many windows. In our bag item, we can create a function called has available slots. So we'll go into this. This will be a public helper function. We'll make this U function blueprint callable. I don't think we'll actually need that, but as available slots. Honestly, we won't do this until we need it. So we'll just keep them public for now. Just be a const. So what this will do is we want to check to see if it has looped through all the items in our bag, and if there's an empty slot, then we'll return true. If not, we'll return false. So what this does, it says for every item in our inventory, if it's equal to null, we know we have an empty spot, we'll automatically return true. If it's equal to false, then, or if all the slots are equal to our valid pointers, then we'll return false, knowing that we don't have anything. So here, where we add another validation, we check to see it does have available slots. Inside our bag item, we can now call that function. So before we even attempt to add the item, we're going to check to see if we have available slots. Now, this could also be combined inside our bag item, but I kind of like the way it's set up here. All right. Okay, so I think I'm going to end it here. Thank you all for joining, and talk to you all next time.